All right, Josh Whalen here at Alterra Advisors, and I'm joined today by Michael Geoghegan. He's the owner of Northwest Strategy and Planning. Michael is a wills and probate attorney and has a wide range of capabilities, but focuses in on wills for parents. So wanted to have Michael join us for a discussion today, kind of about this topic, some of his thoughts, and answer a couple of key questions that we get regularly from a lot of you. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Wanted to start with the topic about who needs wills. It sounds like they're pretty important for parents. So, why do parents need wills, and does everybody need a will?
It's a good question, and one that I get quite a bit, obviously, in my line of work. I make wills for parents because parents can most often tell that they need a will. A lot of people need wills, but at a point when you have little humans who are dependent on you, the question comes up, well, what would happen if neither of the two parents were there to parent the child? And who would be the guardian? And how would money be held by a trustee? All of those things come kind of pressing in. So a lot of my clients call me with that as their first and foremost thought. Now, there are other people who need wills and they can't tell, or it's not as urgent to do something about it. Wills are not just for people who have like a helicopter and a golf course and this massive estate. A lot of it is just organizing things for whoever's going to survive you so that it goes well. Like what would be the things that you would want to put in order so that someone could just pick up a document and know, okay, this is the person who's in charge, do X, Y, and Z with my possessions. Here's how you take care of these family members. Here's how you arrange a funeral. Here's how could act for me if I was in the hospital. All these things go into the planning documents. And it's interesting because when I work with clients who've had a family member pass away, their relationship to all this is so different. Because they were either left a mess that they had to sort out, or they were left a beautiful set of instructions they could follow, but they're kind of delighted at this idea, oh, I could do this for someone else. So I often work with clients because they can tell, but in fact, a wide range of people come through my door to figure out what would we need to put in place.
Yeah, one of the things that comes up in discussions a lot with our clients about this, and why we end up making lots of introductions, is that we'll ask about this, and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, it's something I've been meaning to do for so long," and so that really kind of narrowing that down to the wills for parents, streamlined, accessible, and efficient for people, like you said, with little humans nipping at their heels and ankles all the time and requiring their attention.
It's a funny mix, right? Because people know that they need to do it. But I also call it the rock in the to-do list. Like it's always sinking down to the bottom. People are like, they'll come up, they're like, oh yeah, I really should do that. And you can hold that thought for like 24, 48 hours. And then any other thing on your to-do list will become more important than to follow through on making a will. So especially when a parent calls me and says, oh, I want to do this, the call often goes like this. This is my call this morning. I just had my second child. We've been putting this off for 4 years. I want to do this. Would you work with me? And then we went through the whole process to figure out, did it make sense and how could I help? But it's that perpetual feeling of like, oh, I've been putting this off. Where could I get resource for someone who would actually sit me down and take the momentum I have to act on it and execute on it and make the thing before it goes out of sight for like another 3 to 5 years, and it'll pop up again and then they'll figure out what to do. So that when people have those moments, that's great for me as an attorney because I can work with them and help them take advantage.
Makes sense. So you probably see, a number of families that are the husband, wife, 2 kids, and a dog, and create wills and basic estate plans for them. What about families that don't fit into that kind of description? What does planning look like for them? What's different and what's similar?
Oh, you mean the other 95% of my clients? Yeah, right. There is this perception. So it's interesting, the default laws around wills, if you don't have a will, there's a default law that talks about what happens to your possessions. There's the intestacy laws of Washington. But they very much conceive of families in these very traditional kind of like 1950s terms. There's a husband and a wife and they have kids, and in fact, a lot of my clients have lives that don't conform to that. It was a second marriage. Someone had a child by a first relationship. Maybe it's a queer couple. That's now been sort of normalized because marriage laws extend to everybody. blended families, families that have someone who has a disability or a brother or sister who has a substance abuse issue. There are all these wrinkles that families have that you have to tease out and think, how do we not just make a plan, but how do we make it go well for each member of the family within that unit? And acknowledge that very few people fit in perfectly. Or every family, even if they fit on paper, have all their crazy. Like every family has crazy. And it's my job to hold that, accept it, think, does this have a bearing on this process? And if so, like, how do we plan around it, right? So there's, the nice thing is that I've seen so many different scenarios now that very little surprises me. It's very rare that I get a new thing that I haven't confronted. And lawyers everywhere have been thinking creatively about how to accommodate that. So there are ways that you can think about, how do I leave something for my spouse, but also make sure that my biological child is never cut out of my will if I were to pass away first. It's a very common issue. Even if it's not your concern, it could be your child's concern someday in the future. And there are ways to work through that. And just make things, in general, the goal with every plan is, how do you take people's uncertainty and eliminate it? How do you write down something so clear on paper that everybody knows exactly where they stand? Because where there's uncertainty, people fill in the blanks with their worst fears. Maybe I won't, maybe no one thought about me, maybe I don't have any security. And they fill in those blanks, and it can get really out of control. But if you put it down on paper and you think with foresight and you have a really clean conversation, even families that don't conform on paper to what we might think is like the norm, there's a way to make a beautiful plan and sort of accommodate that. But it's something we think about, and it's something I'm looking for in every intake. I'm thinking, what's unique about this person? Not how do they fit into the box, but like, where might this sort of stray out of the lines, and how would we then accommodate it and bring it back in?
Yeah, my family growing up, I always thought was the picture perfect white picket fence, the whole 9 yards family. And I realized quickly that sometimes it takes leaving the home you grew up in to recognize the crazy that lies in that home. So I think you're exactly right. We've all got our crazy, that's for sure.
Yeah, I grew up in a family that actually got on really, really well. And then it was years later that I learned from my mom that my grandmother had cut off all kinds of people that we just literally had no contact with because they were deemed so crazy that we were like, no relationship was possible. I was like, oh, now this makes more sense. We weren't normal at all. We were like way over on the other end if you actually like acknowledge what was happening. So it's the fun part. I'm a people person. I love, and I have confidentiality with my clients. So I'm there to talk with them. I'm there to be a resource. I'm curious. I kind of want to know all this stuff. And the more I know, the more I can help someone through that. So it's never a thing to hold you back, but it is a reason to actually sit down with someone who's seen your scenario a couple times to say, okay, well, here are some standard pathways. How would this work? And how we then tailor it to your specific situation to make it work.
So what about pets? I grew up with a couple of dogs, a cat. Never thought about leaving my assets to them when I die. But I've gotten this question many times throughout the time that I've done financial planning with families. So do pets belong in a will? Can you name them in a will? Is this something that people do? And if so, how do you address that?
Yes, it is something that people do. So this is actually quite a delicate question. And it's one of the most interesting parts of my client meetings as I devote a part of my meeting specifically to address pets and think about it. And I genuinely have no idea where the conversation will go. It's all very dependent on my client and their pet, right? So by law, you can actually leave a trust for your pet. I generally don't favor that. There are more flexible ways of leaving money to a human being who can care for your pet. Rather than leaving it to the pet who cannot actually express in writing any opinions about what to do with the funds. So, but there's a respectful place that's interesting to think about logistically. If you have a pet, maybe you're the only person who knows that the lady next door loves your dog more than anything and should absolutely be the pet's caretaker. If you're the only person who knows that, put it in the will, like tell somebody. And maybe she needs some money because pets are expensive. That's just a fact of life. Once you own a pet, you start to add up the vet bills and the vaccinations and the everything. You're like, whoa, okay, the dog walking on your vacation. So I have clients who will say, here's my pet. I want my pet to stay with my children. If it can't stay with my children, then I want it to go to my father, my sister, my neighbor, Eddie down the street, and here's some amount of money that makes sense to me. And that can range from like $100 to like $30,000. And none of that would be like outside of what's normal. But for each person, they have to sort of make it make sense to them. And what makes sense to someone else sitting next to them might seem totally ridiculous. So we just put everybody else aside and say, what about you? What about your pet? Now, there's a logistical piece to this. If you pass away, it takes a little while for people to go and find your will. It's not the first thing they do. And it may well be that your pet has already been taken care of. No one's like, well, just leave the cat there for a couple of weeks until we find the will, right? People are human. They have a heart, and they go in, and they make decisions, and they do things. But again, if you're the only person who knows that information, the will is a nice place to park it. Tell someone, and make it possible for it to work.
One of the things that you've helped me understand about this topic is the will is not just this technical legal document, although it is that. It's a way to make sure, but bigger picture, it's a way to make sure that your wishes make it through the legal system. And so the description of maybe you're the only person who knows the neighbors is, this cat or this dog is this person's favorite animal. And why not make sure that person is its caretaker should something happen to you? It makes so much sense. You would write that down in a letter. You'd write it down in instructions if you were on vacation. Why wouldn't you write it in your will?
And it's actually a very interesting point about wills that I really like wills because they're such a choose your own adventure. It's wide open. People are like, can I do this in a will? Can I do that in a will? And I say, absolutely. No, it's not always wise, or we'll have to take their idea and sort of work with it into something that's feasible or practical. But there's a lot of space to do things that are beautiful, that are thoughtful about your extended network, your church community, a charity you think about, your pets. And in particular, this goes back a little bit to the blended family idea. One of the things I love about wills is you define your family however you want to in a will. It's always one of the first parts of the will. You say, this is me. If you're married, it's important to say that. If you have children, you name them. But you can name the child who's always been yours, even if you never legally adopted them, right? You're stating, these are my people, regardless how anybody else sees it. And this is how I want to account for them and accommodate for them. And there's something beautiful in that. And that includes a pet. It includes lots of different things. But there's space in the will to do that with a little creativity.
So maybe you can describe the parts of a basic estate plan, what they are, a brief description about them, why they're important.
Yes. I don't know which lawyers came up with the titles for all the different documents in the estate plan, but they were not talking to their marketing department. It's atrocious and confusing. Everything that's wrong with the legal system and makes it inaccessible to regular human beings. There's a will. People generally know that that's a thing. A will takes effect after you pass away and gives the instructions for what to do. But any competent attorney who makes a will should also be having their clients make a power of attorney document that says, I may still be very much alive. So the will is not even active or effective at that point. But if you're in the hospital, who would make decisions for you? Who would make healthcare decisions for you, or move around assets to pay for your bills, or settle a lawsuit? Power of attorney documents name people to act while you're still alive. And I think power of attorney documents, it conveys nothing in the name. There's nothing in the name to tell you, to decipher, like, what could that possibly do? But they're vitally important. And, we happen right now to be in the middle of the COVID pandemic. I talk to people about power of attorney for healthcare, and they're like, oh, yes, I get it. That's a thing I would want to do. A year ago, that all sounded so ethereal. Like, well, maybe if I was a senior citizen someday in the future, and my mind wasn't working so clearly, that would be important. But now people are like, oh, yeah, I need that. And at the point that you need it, it's too late to make it. If you've lost the capacity to speak for yourself, you can't sign a document to appoint someone else. So now when there's no crisis, that's when you make power of attorney documents. There's always power of attorney documents, ideally one for healthcare, one for assets. There's a will that talks about your estate in general, what should happen. And then there are a couple other things that I do for clients. I think it's important to talk about whether you want to be buried or cremated. Your disposition remains, or now composting is now legal in Washington. It's a very sweet thing to just say, these are my values, family, and now go forth, instead of having them be pressured by a funeral home about the right way to memorialize a family member that may involve like $12,000 of mahogany caskets and flowers, right? So just saying, these are my values, operate with reference to this is nice. And I have all of my clients make a contact sheet. Just how would you reach family on both sides of the family? How would you find the financial planner or the CPA or the person who handles insurance or the life insurance policies, the retirement accounts? I work with families after someone has passed away, and it's very difficult sometimes to piece together the financial life of someone who's passed. Even if it's a close family member, like, where is your mom's safety deposit box? And are you sure that's the only one? Well, it would be nice if she just took a piece of paper and wrote it all down. So I tell my clients, do that now. Put it down. The exercise of 20 minutes of putting that together could save someone hours and hours later. So there's some legal components, some very practical how to make this work components. But I'd say wills, power of attorney documents, something about disposition of remains, and a contact sheet is a solid start. I mean, you can put bells and whistles on that, but those pieces should absolutely be there.
And for anyone with kids or pets, naming guardianship for them, which of those elements would that be included in?
So that goes into the will. The will is the point where a guardian has to be named by the court, and they're looking for the will to have the information about what to do. For anything long-term and binding after you pass away, a will carries that information. Now, in fact, I work with so many parents, and I am a parent, so I think a lot about sort of the neurotic side of how to cover different scenarios, eventualities. So I'll name a temporary guardian if parents are both in the hospital. Which person could step in on a temporary basis and make daycare arrangements for your child's pickup, or do anything that has to be done in the child's name, like medical decision-making, until a parent's back on the scene? Now, in fact, people have gotten by without that piece. But I kind of I think so much about parenting and what roles are named. Sometimes I'll do, and often I'll do for parents in a power of attorney document, a temporary guardian. But the real big thing that my clients who are parents come in on and are churning on is like, what would happen if I wasn't here? And the will is the place that holds that information.
So what are some of the things you see that are maybe pitfalls of basic estate planning? All this whole process you've created, and that you've just spent some time describing to us. What maybe technical things could go wrong, and then what are just some practical things that you see that don't end up working the way they're maybe intended to?
It's interesting to me. My clients call me up, and almost across the board, the conversation will all start the same way. I need to make a will. I've been putting this off for a while, and I'd like help, and I think that my estate's pretty easy. And I always say, okay, at this point in my career, I'm like, great, but let's ask some questions. Let's find out. Let's sort of test that hypothesis, because the things that make wills complicated are not intuitive. They're not the things that are obvious to you, or you just live your life and you don't walk around and be like, God, my life is so complicated. It makes sense to you. But when you sort of push it through this process, some things can come out that can make things complicated. So a common one is if you own property in more than one state. That can create some real complications for family later, where they have to take your will to every state, every jurisdiction where you have real property. And it could be a reason to think about some alternatives to wills that we haven't discussed, like revocable living trusts that are a more complex version of accomplishing the same thing. So there's gradations of complexity, and you have to figure out, I want to make things as complicated as is necessary. So in Washington, we start off talking about wills, but we'll introduce more complex stuff when needed. Having property in more than one state, or a definitive plan, like I live here in Washington, but I'm absolutely going to move to California in 4 years. We all know it. Those are things that can make wills complicated because there are jurisdictional issues about wills that are really state-specific. A big one that I worry about a lot with my parent clients is they'll make a trust for their kids. They say, if both parents pass away, we'll leave money for our kids. but we're going to decide the age when they are old enough to inherit. 25, 35, 72, whatever it is that they think is like the right age, right? But they also have life insurance policies, they have retirement plans that have to be coordinated with their will through beneficiary designations. And this is getting into the weeds, but it's very, very important. Your will determines a lot of how your assets pass, but life insurance and retirement accounts will pass based on whatever name you've put in the form that you got from HR on your first day at work, where they're like, what to do? And you're like, just filling it out. You didn't know that was like a vitally important form someday. So making sure that those assets that you leave for your kids are rooted through the trust turns out to be vitally important. And it's a piece that can often get missed because the lawyer doesn't actually fill out those forms for you. You have to do it in a way that's coordinated. So I worry a lot about that piece falling through. And the problem is life insurance, $1 million life insurance policy, you can't give that to a child under 18. They literally will not give that money to a minor. So what happens to it? It can get stuck in a blocked account, and all this nasty stuff can happen as a result of a minor slip of just not properly filling out a beneficiary designation to coordinate it with your estate plan. So that's like a keep me up at night kind of problem. And then the other thing that I worry about a lot is people filling out a will, just sort of filling in blanks. They're so excited that they got it done, they never sign it, or they signed it but they never witnessed it. They never went through some of the basic mechanics of what makes a will effective in Washington. I worked with a client who had made a will, but it was some template she got from a friend from Louisiana. It was a will, but it didn't actually correspond to Washington law. There are like weird quirks about, having a non-intervention will, waiving bond. Those are things that are important in Washington wills. But just getting a template that doesn't necessarily cue you to think about those things or ask those questions or even tell you what they mean can be a pitfall that I worry about. So those are things, they're obscure. They don't sort of present themselves as issues in an obvious way, but they come up a lot. And I'm constantly navigating with that. And I can kind of work quickly because I've done this own process. I think, oh, here we do this, 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 this. And I think it's not easy for the person who's never done it to walk in the door and even decipher what some of this stuff means, much less why it would be important and how would it actually play out if someone had to pick up the will and do a thing. So it's a sort of a weird, obscure corner of the legal world.
Well, and yes, all of that. One additional thing that you do for a lot of folks in your process that I've seen be a pitfall in the past as well is just not knowing who to contact about what. And that contact sheet that you make is so critical. Here's who to contact about all the retirement accounts and all the insurance policies and the financial plan and the taxes and the attorneys. It's helpful in financial planning. It's helpful in so many areas. We've worked with folks that one spouse handles the finances and then gets incapacitated in some way, and the spouse who didn't handle the finances, at least the day-to-day kind of the mechanics of it, doesn't really know where to look, and there's accounts that just show up and are missed, and could put you in jeopardy of kind of just having these different pieces all over the place, but not knowing who to contact about them. And so that's a logistical piece that you do for folks I know in your process that is critical and helpful from an organizational standpoint.
I 100% agree, and I think it's very common for couples to delegate the responsibility around accounts to one person. And so just even putting it down so the other person would know where to look. I don't ask for account numbers. I don't want your passwords. I don't want someone to pick up that and steal your identity. But what door do you knock on to find this stuff? And interestingly, the standard of practice is when someone passes away, we tell our clients, listen, your mother passed away. I need you to not cancel the mail so we can track the paper billing statements that come in and see what kind of accounts are out there. I'm like, paper billing? You would put together none of my life based on my paper billing trail. I get almost no bills to my house. If that was the one thing you were depending on, you're like, you'd be out of luck. So I do think that simple exercise, again, not just thinking about how to check off your legal blanks, but on a practical level, what makes people successful is a key piece and a very sweet piece. If we have all that information on the table, put it in there. What a difference to have a spouse or family member be able to call a financial planner who says, let me open up their file. Oh, I see where everything is that was listed with me. Rather than just being in the dark, trying to figure out, based on credit card statements and bank statements, what's there. It's such a big difference.
Well, and we spend a lot of time talking about the value of a coordinated plan, and that doesn't just mean a coordinated financial plan, it means a coordinated team of professionals who are aware of one another and can work in synergy behind the scenes on behalf of somebody. So while they're doing what they do best, their team can be taking care of a lot of other things in their financial world and making sure they're not missing anything there. So with that, Michael, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. We've covered quite a bit of ground, and really thankful for your time and your work. So thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure chatting with you.